as we can to make sure that communication is effective for all patients.
And what might surveyors look for to determine compliance with these standards?
Sure. Surveyors very likely will ask the organization about their policies for language access. In addition, they may want to know how did the organization design those policies, upon what did they base their decisions. Surveyors typically come to organizations with an understanding of the demographics of that organization. And organizations that are in highly diverse areas are serving highly diverse populations, this might be something which a surveyor is going to pay particular attention. In addition to asking about the policies and asking organizations how they design those policies, the surveyor will very likely want to observe how these policies are actually implemented. And that could occur during a patient tracer. Perhaps the patient tracer, the chart that is selected is the chart of a person who doesn't speak English. And the surveyor may ask to see how the individual who is providing care to that patient actually accesses the language services that was indicated on the chart. Surveyors may also be looking at the record to make sure that language and communication needs are documented, and there is a standard that the Joint Commission has requiring that these needs are documented in the record. And our point there is that this is important information and needs to be communicated across the continuum of care so that everyone providing care to the patient knows that these needs are there and how to address them. There are a variety of modes of interpreting that are available to organizations to meet the language needs of patients. The Joint Commission doesn't specifically endorse one mode over another. We actually find that a variety of modes used together actually works best to meet the needs of the organization. One of the things that we found from our research during our hospital's language and culture study, we heard from organizations on a number of occasions that they no longer use their bilingual staff to interpret because the Joint Commission doesn't allow that. And I think it's important for us to clarify that that is not correct. The Joint Commission doesn't, as I mentioned, endorse one mode of interpreting over the other. And what we recommend is that organizations make sure that in their plan for language access, that they use resources and modes of interpreting that are accessible, that are in working order, and that actually get used when the need arises. And bilingual staff can serve as an important resource within an organization. However, we do hope that and strongly recommend that organizations who do use bilingual staff train their bilingual staff on how to be an interpreter and also make sure, very importantly, that they are assessed in both the target language as well as English. Sometimes organizations or individuals practicing in hospitals and organizations relied on what we refer to as ad hoc interpreters, such as family members or friends. And this was common not just with individuals who don't speak English, but also was commonly used as a mode for interpreting with the deaf. And I really want to emphasize that this is not a recommended practice. While it may seem that an individual's family member is the ideal person to bridge a communication gap or barrier, we really cannot be sure that that individual is competent to interpret. Interpreting really requires a set of professional skills as well as some training. There are ethics involved, and as providers, we want to make sure that what we are saying to our patient is really accurately being communicated to the patient so that that patient is at greatest, has the greatest opportunity to actually understand.
And Amy, if I can interject, on this point, it is really important to know what the federal law requires. For persons who are deaf, sign language or other interpreters must be qualified. And an interpreter is qualified if they can interpret competently, accurately, and impartially. So in hospital settings, the interpreters also must be able to interpret medical terms and concepts. Hospital personnel who have limited familiarity with sign language should interpret only in emergency situations and for a brief time until a qualified interpreter can be present. So let me reiterate, For the deaf and hard of hearing, for whom the law requires effective communication, the Justice Department has indicated that it is inappropriate to ask family members or other companions to interpret for a person who is deaf or hard of hearing. With respect to limited English proficient persons for whom the law requires meaningful access, our HHS guidance says that healthcare providers cannot require a limited English proficient person to use a family member or friend as an interpreter. Now, sometimes a limited English proficient or a deaf or hard of hearing person prefers to use their family members or a friend even after being offered free language assistance. But providers should be careful. You have the obligation under law to ensure effective communication for the deaf and hard of hearing and meaningful access for limited English proficient persons. It's your obligation. So, if someone elects to use a family member or a friend to provide interpretation, we often advise that healthcare providers take reasonable steps to determine whether the person providing the interpretation as a family member or a friend is competent or qualified to provide this service accurately and impartially. This includes determining whether there could be a conflict of interest, confidentiality or emotional involvement or other concerns that frankly make the use of a family member or friend inappropriate. These concerns are heightened, as Amy notes, and they require an exercise of significant caution if the individual asks to have a minor provide interpretation. Now, if a family member or friend simply isn't competent, the healthcare provider under the law must provide someone who is. And even if the patient or companion agrees that a person is competent to interpret, we advise providers to document in the individual's record that refusal of the offer of a free interpreter. It's just good business practice.
Amy, you explained different types of language access services. Now, Tamara, when we talked earlier about Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, you mentioned auxiliary aids. How are these different?
Auxiliary aids and services are simply a means by which healthcare organizations can provide language assistance for deaf and hard of hearing persons. So, for example, qualified interpreters. We've talked about the need to provide sign language interpreters for the deaf or hard of hearing. That is simply one example of an auxiliary aid or service. But there are many others. Note takers are often provided to assist the deaf or hard of hearing communicate with their providers. Transcription services, written materials. Something as simple as a telephone handset amplifier would help a person who is hard of hearing. Telephone communication devices for deaf persons. Particularly today, with expansions of technology, you're finding more and more video telephones being utilized. Video interpretive services are another example of an auxiliary aid or service. And of course, open and closed captioning. It's just important to understand that with our aging demographics, persons with hearing loss are greatly expected to expand over time. And so persons who are deaf or hard of hearing under the law have an absolute right to effective communication, and certainly those populations will continue to place challenges in our healthcare organizations.
And what indicators might there be on survey that